Welcome, students. Welcome, students. Welcome, students. Grand rising to you all. Welcome to a beautiful new week. Thank you all for being present today. Thank you for using the comment section for a space for you to be able to talk to each other. And also, thank you to those of you who completed their homework assignment and sent me a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful email of your feedback from the questions that you received. So, with that being said, Emily and Sabrina, thank you both for doing an excellent job on your homework assignment. It didn't take you too long, I'm pretty sure. However, it was very, very well thought out, and I truly appreciated reading it. So, thank you for taking your time out to do your homework. May the rest of your classmates follow you as the RCP scholars that you are. I want to take the time to shout out you all because it's super, super important to be able to submit your homework because you'll be doing a check for understanding, that you're not just watching the video to watch it, that you're also getting an understanding of what is being discussed. So make sure that you do your homework. That is going to be posted on the website, and that you are sending it to my email, ksmith@rcpschools.org. All right, so let's get started today. Today, we're going to talk about nature's help meet and pollination for the good of the nation. With that being said, before I get started all the way into the lesson, please tell me how you're doing. How was your weekend? Give me a highlight, some of the cool things you did. What'd you eat? Where'd you go? In the comment section, just so I feel like we're a little bit more connected. And I'll give you time to do that. I'll give you time to do that. And you are also able to type as I'm talking. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about nature's health meet and pollination for the good of the nation. So let's break down the parts of a flower before we even begin to learn about the process of pollination, because it's very important to know what you're talking about instead of just saying all these words and terms. So we have a male part of the flower, and we also have a female part of the flower. The creator is so awesome for being able to show just how much detail goes into creating something as small as a flower. So, as you see, there is the stamen, which is in this region here, and that consists of the anther and the filament. You see the anther there and the filament there. Next, we have the stigma. The stigma, this is a part of the female productive system of the flower, the female parts. We have the stigma, the style, and the ovaries. Then we have our petals, our ovules, and our sepals. So let's break down what these parts are and what their function is, because it's really important to know something's function. So for the stamen, right here, the male reproductive organs of the flower, it has two parts, as we know, the anther and a supporting filament. So the filament is here, the anther is here. The anther is the part of the stamen where pollen is produced. So pollen, pollination, pollen. Pollen is that white dust that is used for pollination. Did I say white? It's like yellow. You'll see it soon. Filament. A filament is the support system of the anther where the pollen develops. This is where the pollen, this long stem is where the pollen is created in the filament, and it supports the anther, which is where pollen is produced. Pollen develops in the filament, pollen is produced in the anther. This is the male part of the flower. Next, we have the female side of the flower. So the female side of the flower, or the female organs, are called the pistil. The pistil is the female organs of a flower, and they consist of the stigma, the style, and the ovaries. So these are parts of the flower that help receive what comes from the stamen. This is the home of the flower, the stigma. The pistil. The pistil is the home of the flower. So the pistil consists of, again, the stigma, the style, and ovaries, right? So the stigma is the head of the pistil. This beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. It's often sticky as well. So the stigma is where the pollen goes. This is what receives the pollen from the anther, from the filament to the anther, picked up, brought to the stigma, right? Okay. This is where fertilization begins, in the stigma. So that's the stigma, and now let's talk about the style, which is right underneath it. This is the style. The style is the stalk of the pistil, which connects the ovaries, see, beautiful ovaries, to the stigma. The style is the connector piece. It connects the dots between the stigma and the ovary. And the ovary is the enlarged portion of the pistil. Don't forget the pistil is the female organ of the flower. And this is where the seeds are going to be able to develop during fertilization. Now, when you look at a beautiful, beautiful ovary of a flower, you're going to learn, or now I'm going to let you know, something's going to blow your mind. The ovary of the flower is what matures into a fruit, either a dry or a fleshy fruit that has the seeds. So this is the part of the fruit. I know, it just blew your mind. I know. The ovary itself of the flower will mature into a fruit. That blew my mind. It might be just me, but that blew my mind. So, we've talked about the parts of a flower. And here are the definitions for you if you would like to just look at them, take your time to see exactly what the parts of the flower are, and you can go back and forth just to sharpen yourself up to be able to see how it all functions. So let's go to slide number 2 that talks about pollination. So we've talked about the parts of the flower, and we've mentioned fertilization. However, before we fertilize, we have to pollinate. So pollination is the process of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a female. Okay, let's go back. Pollination is the process of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma, the male part to the female part, later producing seeds that are spread by the wind or animals. So let's see that. So here we have a bee. This is our pollinator. The bee is the pollinator. And the bee is visiting the flower and it collects the nectar, right? And as it's collecting the nectar from the flower, pollen is rubbed onto the bee's body, right? Because it's hopping on there and it is being able to collect pollen on the body of it. So then the pollinator or the bee goes to the next flower, and that is where the pollen is put onto the stigma, which begins the process of pollination. So this bee, I think it knows what it's doing. However, its intention is to get the nectar. And as it goes from each flower, that's when the process of pollination is. All right. It's getting good. It's getting good. It's getting good. Let's go to what the goal is. What is the goal of like creatures or animals and plants and people? So the goal of every living organism, every living thing, including plants, is to create offspring for the next generation. It's to be fruitful and multiply. So one of the ways that plants can produce offspring is by making seeds. So we're going to learn a little bit about that. Let me show you this right here. So when it comes to plants producing seeds, we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So plants produce flowers. You see these beautiful flowers right here? Plants produce flowers in order to make the seeds. And to make a seed a flower, that flower must be pollinated. Pollen from the male part of one flower travels to the female part of another flower, and we've seen that. And in the female part of the flower is where the seeds are made. The petals, as you see, of said flowers are what is attracting the animals to the flower, which will carry the pollen from one flower to another. So these beautiful creatures are attracted to the petals. That's what brings them in. And then they do their job by pollinating as they're getting the nectar. We got our butterflies, and we got our bees. Bats also are super great pollinators. Okay, so we have this diagram. This diagram is talking about the different types of pollination. So we have a super cool type of pollination that is called self-pollination. And self-pollination is when the pollen from the anther, you see the anther right there where the arrow is pointed? The anther of a flower is transferred to the stigma of the same flower or the stigma of a different flower on the same plant. So pollination occurs and then a seed is able to form. And the fact that this can happen is pretty mind-blowing to me. So this transfer can actually happen when the pollen grains literally spill onto the stigma, or the transfer can occur with the aid of a pollinator, a bee, a bat, a bird, things like that, a butterfly. Also, the wind and water are also used and can be used in self-pollination. However, a thing to know about the flowers or the plants that, or the flowers of the plants that use self-pollination, that their plants and their flowers are much smaller, the ones who do self-pollination. Then we have the animals like the bees, the butterflies, the moths, the flies, hummingbirds. They pollinate plants accidentally. I think they know what they're doing a little bit. However, overall, it's an accident because they're coming not to pollinate, however, they're coming for the nectar. So, while they're feeding, the animals accidentally rub against the stamen and get pollen stuck all over themselves. And when they move to another flower to feed, some of the pollen can rub off onto this new plant stigma, from stigma to stigma. Now, cross-pollination happens when the same plant of a different variety in a garden space, the wind blows or a bee travels into the flower and of one plant, and the pollen of this plant makes its way to another type of plant. So that's cross-pollination, when it goes from one plant that is of its own kind to another plant that's of a different kind. That is cross-pollination. All right, let's dig a little bit deeper and let's see the cool part about this is the write-up. So if you want to read it while you're taking notes and sitting in your homework, please do that. This video here is going to show a super excellent way of seeing and experiencing and just a better understanding of pollination. And after this video, I highly encourage you to take notes during the video, because on your homework assignment on Thursday, you're definitely going to have to summarize the things that you've learned in today's lesson about pollination. So let's go.
Chocolate comes from the cocoa tree. Midges pollinate the cocoa flowers, so if you like chocolate, you can thank these tiny flies. In fact, most of our fruit crops, grains, and vegetables need to be pollinated. It's no exaggeration to say our lives depend on pollinators. Let's learn more about pollination. Pollination is a key step in sexual reproduction among all flowering plants. The purpose of pollination is to allow individual plants to exchange genetic information. Flowering plants belong in the plant group of angiosperms. The majority of angiosperms are pollinated by animals. Other angiosperms, such as grasses and many species of trees, are wind-pollinated. Flowers are the sexual organs of plants. All flowers include the stamen or male organ and the pistil or female organ, which contains one or more carpels. The stamen produces pollen. Pollen is a fine powder comprised of pollen grains. Pollen is released from the anther, which is part of the stamen. Pollen contains male gametes. As a result of pollination, pollen is transported from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another. Pollination culminates in fertilization. When pollen grain arrives on the stigma at the top of the carpel, it stimulates formation of a pollen tube along the style. The pollen grain travels down the tube, eventually reaching the ovule at the base of the carpel. After the male gamete fertilizes the female gamete in the ovule, seed and fruit development begins. Because plants are not mobile, they must rely on various agents to carry out pollination. Plants can be pollinated in two ways: wind and animals. Wind-pollinated plants have small, dull flowers, lacking petals and nectar. Their pollen is shaken free and transported by the wind. These plants produce a large amount of pollen, gambling that some of it will make it to another flower. The more pollen that is produced, the more chance there is that the pollen will encounter a stigma belonging to another flower. Nearly all grasses are wind-pollinated. About 80% of flowering plants rely on animals to transfer pollen. Most of these animals are insects, including bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps, and flies. Some vertebrates are also pollinators, notably hummingbirds and some other birds. Even some bats and small mammals are frequent pollinators. So what is in it for the animals? How do plants encourage pollinators? Most plants supply some form of reward, often some sort of food, like nectar within the flower. Other plants use deception to fool pollinators. This orchid, for example, mimics the female pheromone, making its flower irresistible to the male bee. The male bees try to mate with the orchid, inadvertently pollinating it. Once the animal arrives, the flower deposits the pollen on the visitor. Upon its visit to the next flower, the pollen is transferred to the stigma. Animals and plants are engaged in a mutualistic relationship. In most cases, both the plant and the animals benefit from their interaction. Animals get a reward, while the plant is able to pollinate.
All right. So that was super cool. I love the fact that that flower was able to mimic the female pheromone so that the other, so that the plant that didn't know that it wasn't a female animal or insect, and that it tried to mate with it. And as a result of it trying to mate with it, it started to pollinate it. So that's super smart. Love our creations. Grateful for the creator for the creations. And I'm thankful for you all for being present to receive this information. So make sure that you focus in, pay attention, rewind it, pause it, process the information, and get ready for Thursday's homework situation. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to another video.